We're going to focus our attention this morning on the entire chapter of Jonah, chapter 1, but we're going to read for this morning verses 1 through 3. So Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. And these are God's words. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. May the Lord add a blessing to the readers, hearers, and doers of his holy, inerrant, and infallible word. You may be seated. Well, we've gotten here. Had a bumpy road to get here. Amos was a bumpy road. But this is my favorite book of the Bible, or one of the, it's very like in the top 3, very close. And so I'm excited to preach this. But first, let me tell you a story. I mean, that's what preachers do, right? So in high school, before I graduated, which was a very long time ago, my parents awarded me with the opportunity to go to prom before I was old enough to actually go to prom. Corey, you remember this story? I don't know. You might remember this story. So I was invited to go to prom as a participant in what they call lead out. Do they still do lead out? Anybody ever heard of that? They do lead out? Okay, good, awesome. So my parents gave me the opportunity to go to this, and unbeknownst to them, I really wasn't mature enough to go to this. They thought I was. I love you, Mom. I was not old enough to go to this. I'm not mature. I was old enough, I wasn't mature enough. So they had this thing called senior lead out. And senior lead out, as Holly knows, people from the community normally would come and observe and support the seniors as their names are getting called, and the seniors would be introduced one by one, and they would come out on stage along with their dates, and everyone would cheer for them and celebrate how nice they look, and then they call on the next person and so forth and so on as they walk through this decorated walkway. So I wasn't a senior, I wasn't a junior, no one invited me to attend prom, but the lead out gave me an opportunity to get out of the house and be a part of all the hype. I wanted to see what the hype was about. I had never been to a lead out, so I took the opportunity. Now keep in mind, my mom and dad told me to be home after the lead out. Corey's laughing because he knows where this is going. But after the lead out, I was invited with some friends to go grab some food, which I did. Again, this was not a part of the plan that I went over with my parents. I told my parents I was gonna go to lead out, and after lead out, I was coming home. But I decided, hey, what is it gonna hurt to go, hang out, grab a bite to eat for a few minutes? They won't know, right? Lead out, who knows? They don't know how long lead out lasts. So I decided to do that. I hung out with a few minutes for my friends, got something good to eat, and then after we hung out, somebody had another great idea. It was like, hey man, they're having an after prom party, so why don't we go to the after prom party? Again, this was not a part of the plan. But I figured, hey, what's a few more minutes? They don't know how long lead out lasts. This thing could last for hours. So we left the food, and then we went to the lead out, or we went to the after prom party. And at some point in time during all of this, the food, the lead out, the after prom party, it became abundantly clear to me that I was going to be in an incredible amount of trouble when I got home. It just got clearer and clearer. Probably an indicator was that I was being buzzed with my pager, because back then we had beepers. We didn't have cell phones. So I was getting beeped incessantly by my father. And, I basically said to myself, well, Brian, you've messed up this time, so you might as well go all in. Now, I know it sounds incredibly stupid, but you have to remember, at this point in time, I'm a 16-year-old teenage boy. I haven't processed all the angles on this. I just said, hey, They're calling you, you're not answering. It's gotten way too late. So hey, just go all in because there's no telling when you're gonna ever get back out of the house. So that's what I did. I went all in. I was getting paged incessantly. And my story was gonna be that when I got home, I lost my pager, but then I realized how silly is that? It doesn't matter if you lose your pager, you'll just go home. You're not gonna stay out all night just because you lost your pager. So I was just like, I'm just gonna throw that story away and I'm just gonna tell my dad, I just messed up. And that's what I did. I stayed out all night and hung out at the after prom party and had a really, really, really good time. But of course, this story does not end well. And neither did my ability to take my car anywhere for a very, very long time. Now, for whatever reason, maybe fear, maybe a false sense of the pleasure that I was going to enjoy at the party, maybe just simply immaturity or even just flat out defiance. I don't really know what was running through my head that day. But for some reason, I continued to run farther and farther away from the original instruction that I received. Despite the fact that it wasn't for my good to keep going farther and farther and farther away from the instruction that I received. Can any of you relate to this, by the way? Maybe your story isn't like mine. Maybe you weren't as immature or as silly as I was at 16 years old on a prom night. But can you nevertheless relate to this story where God maybe was calling you in one direction and you decided to move in a totally opposite direction to where he was calling you? Maybe you were fearful of where he was calling you to. Maybe you were having too much fun in the nonsense that you were in, so you didn't want to turn from it. Or maybe despite the fact that he's God and you're not, you just didn't trust his path enough. It just felt like your path would yield a better outcome. So you just kept running and running and running farther and farther and farther away from God's direction. A lot of you said, yes, I can relate. Well, I'll tell you what, Jonah can as well. Jonah is the next minor prophet in our list, and he can relate. Maybe not to my prom story, but he can relate to running farther and farther and farther away from God when he's calling us. The minor book of Jonah is written in a totally different style than the other minor prophets that we've studied in our series thus far. This book's attention is on the prophet's personal story, not the message that the prophet is taking to the people. And that's very interesting. But it's done that way because I believe there is an even bigger prophetic message for us in the prophet's story than in the actual prophet's message. Let's look at this story together. Beginning at verse 3, it says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, 'Rise and go to Nineveh, the great city, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me.' But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa, found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord." Here's what's interesting. First point is that Jonah has a disobedience towards the disobedient. It's very strange. God has called him and mandated him to operate and to move on mission. And he says, to those people, as disobedient as they are, I'm not doing it. Isn't that strange? Now, it's worth our time just to talk a little bit about the city of Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital city in the Assyrian Empire. It was a massive city, a 3 days walk we'll later read in the book of Jonah. A 3 days walk to get from one end to the other. 120,000 people we'll learn later in the book of Jonah, possibly more. It's massive for an ancient city. And it appears to be incredibly prosperous and incredibly evil. As a matter of fact, Nineveh is like a textbook version of evil cities, right? It's like the Gotham City of ancient cities. Any Batman fans out? Okay, maybe not. All right. So nevertheless, it's a very evil city, and God's people were subjected to the harsh rule of Assyrians at different points in time in history. And so God's people were subjected to their rule. It's a very evil city. And so this is not an easy city to like. And Israel was not fans of this city. This is why Jonah is called to go to Nineveh and prophesy to the city that God is bringing a reckoning to them if they do not repent. And this is why Jonah is not interested in going. And let's take a moment and talk about Jonah. So that's Nineveh. Now let's talk about Jonah. What we know about Jonah right out of the gate is that he is not interested in proclaiming God's warning to Nineveh. But we are not given all the details immediately as to why, so we have to kind of fill them in until they become clearer later on in the book. However, we do hear of Jonah one other time in Scripture, and interesting enough, it is during the reign of Jeroboam II. Now, that name sounds familiar to you because we've just spent an entire book with a prophet, Amos, talking to Jeroboam II, all right? Now, remember what Amos was saying to Jeroboam II. No good news. But this is what Jonah has in 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 23. We hear this. He says, in the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Samaria, and he reigned 41 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And he did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and which he made Israel to sin. He restored the border of Israel from Lebo Hamath as far as the sea of Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke by his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, who was with Gath-Hepher. So Jonah goes and gives Jeroboam the word of the Lord. And it's not a harsh word. I guess God saves all the ammo for Amos. And so Jonah doesn't give him a really harsh word, but Jonah nevertheless is willing to give an evil man the word of the Lord. That's interesting. He did not hesitate to give an evil man the word of the Lord. And so the question we have to ask is, why not? And already you have a possible peek into what may be going on with Jonah. We're going to see more of it later. But just from there, you have a peek. Because he's reluctant to prophesy to these evil people in Nineveh who are his enemies. But he has no problem prophesying to an evil man who's his leader and a part of his camp. Maybe you've seen this in your own life. Maybe even in the lives of others. Sometimes our tolerance for evil increases the closer the evil is to our camp. In other words, I can call out your brother, but you better not call out my brother. I can call out your sister, but you better not call out my sister. You don't know what she's been through. Are you tracking with that? I could call out your leader, but you better not call out mine. I could call out the evil I witness in your people group, but let's just disregard the blatant missteps in my own people group. Typically, we see it too often. The closer we get to our camp, the more tolerance we have for the evil in our camp. Jonah from the very beginning is displaying a little of this, and this in large part is why he begins his journey of disobedience away from the presence of God. So Jonah goes from God, Nineveh. God's telling him to go to Nineveh. He goes from God to Tarshish, away from God. And the contrast between Nineveh, where Nineveh was, and where Tarshish was couldn't be greater. Nineveh was located east of the Tigris River in modern-day Iraq. It was more than 500 miles east of Jonah's hometown. Tarshish, in contrast, is about 2,500 miles west of Israel. 500 miles east is where Jonah's supposed to go. 2,500 miles west is where he's trying to go. How committed was Jonah to disobeying God and running away from God's calling? Jonah was willing to travel 3,000 miles. And I'm not even talking about 3,000 miles like in modern day times, 3,000 miles on Delta, 3,000 miles on American. I'm talking about 3,000 miles in ancient times on a boat in the opposite direction of where God called him to go. Jonah literally couldn't pick. He picks the most distant place west that he can pick to get away from God. Now, why is Jonah's rebellion so elaborate, you may ask? Because we cannot assume his rebellion was just for the simple reason of him despising God. Jonah was not some random unbeliever that we pick up and we start reading about. He was a prophet of God that had been used by God before to speak to God's people in Israel on his behalf. So what is the difference here that prompts his rebellion? The difference is found in who God was sending him to. He was sending him to the Assyrians. And the Assyrians were the bad guys for Jonah. And thus, it's safe to say, he would not have only seen them as a threat, he would have considered them morally and ethically and ethnically inferior. And yet, this is exactly the type of people God would call Jonah to go to. The people that Jonah sees as a threat, the people that Jonah sees as ethnically and ethically and morally inferior. He would send that. That's the kind of God we have. Say, yeah, go to those people and warn them in order that they may repent. Jonah ran because God's call was counterproductive to what he probably thought should happen to Nineveh. Jonah ran because he said to himself, those people don't need saving. Have you seen them in action, God? Notice how Jonah's contempt for this disobedient people is now driving him to disobedience. Have you ever witnessed this in your own life? Have you ever seen your disgust, your contempt, your anger for another drive you towards the disobedience and disregard for their salvation? I'll never forgive them. Even though God says, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. You see that? Your anger, your disgust, your contempt driving you away from the presence of God rather than driving you towards the presence of God. That's what's happening here with Jonah. Is your camp, let me ask you a question, is your camp so exclusive that you disobey God when he calls you to go to people outside of it? When he calls you to engage people outside of it? When he calls you to love people outside of it? When he calls you to show mercy to the people outside of it? Does your gospel make room for your enemies? Does your gospel make room for really bad people? Does your gospel make room for people who have even hurt you? Does your gospel make room for all of those people to hear the word of the Lord, to see the love of the Lord, and to be saved by that witness? Let me be honest with you. If it doesn't, then it is a short-circuited gospel. It is an ineffective gospel. It is a gospel that is not working properly. You see, missions, our work to the world, is short-circuited when we believe our lives are more valuable or more righteous than the lives of others. Missions is short-circuited. Our work in the world is short-circuited when we believe when we can only see the animosity in those around us and not the potential for salvation and redemption. How often does our story, because of these things, how often does our story of God calling us to obedience begin like this? God said, go, but we rose and fled. How often does our story look like Jonah's? For whatever reason, for a variety of reasons, not just your story, my story. How often does it look like Jonah's? How often does your life consist of excusing your personal disobedience while condemning the disobedience in others? Here's another very interesting point that we find also in this text as we are walking through Jonah's disobedience. First of all, we see the use of the word Tarshish. He goes over and over and over and over it again. Jonah is going to Tarshish. A few minutes later, and he's going to Tarshish. A few minutes later, by the way, Jonah's going to Tarshish. It's like the author is shouting at us, can you believe this? But here's another thing that's happening. He continues to use the word down. I love this. Many theologians kind of unpack this for us, but he continues to use the word down. For example, you look at verse 2, arise, go to Nineveh. Verse 3, but Jonah decided not to do that. And what did he do? He went down to Joppa. Now, the first time you may think, okay, geographically it's down, so I get it. But then he says, he went down to Joppa, and then he paid the fare, or found the ship, paid the fare, and went down into the ship. And then, later on, the storm comes, and the mariners, the sailors, they have to go down into the innermost part of the ship to find Jonah, who had laid down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, what do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. Now, there's something interesting happening here because the Hebrew version, they can use a lot of words for down in the Hebrew, or at least a lot of different kind of variances, but they use the same one. And there's a reason that theologians believe that they're using the same one. They're trying to drive home a point for us, and it is this, that as Jonah gets farther and farther away from God in defiance and disobedience, he is spiraling further and further down. You see, when we make a decision to move away from the presence of God, it is not just a movement away from God, it is a descent further and further down. And that's the point that they're making, that this decision to disobey is taking him down. And yet, we see God pursuing him, which is the next point. God pursues the runner. Jonah's disobedient towards disobedient people, but God pursues the runner. Verse 4, he says, but the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had laid down and was fast asleep. And so the captain came and said to him, what do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. Pay attention to God's pursuit of those that he lays claim to. That even though Jonah was seeking to get as far away from God as he possibly could, God would not allow it. God relentlessly pursues us even as we actively disobey him and seek refuge somewhere else. You know this to be true in your own life. How has God pursued you in the storm through your times of rebellion? Notice that God's push to get Jonah back on track isn't a mild nudge. It isn't a gentle whisper. Instead, it's a ferocious storm that rages and roars without ceasing. God's pursuit of the runner isn't always quiet, and it isn't always peaceful. Love, grace, and mercy can sometimes be soft and quiet like a whisper, but it can also be loud and turbulent like a storm. Are there some ways in your own life that you can recall God almost passively allowing you or actively forcing you, almost like forcing you into a spot, into a moment, into a situation that forced you to confront him in ways that you would not have without it? We would all like to believe that God gently asks all of us, and we all say, oh yeah, God, I've been waiting on you to ask me, for the last 19 years, for the last 20, for the last 30. But there are times that God confronts us turbulently to arrest our attention and our focus on him. He's doing that with Jonah. Notice another thing in this moment. Verse 5, the mariners again were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. The men that are aboard, they plead for their gods, for their idols to respond and to save them, but they do so to no avail. Notice that idols are at their quietest when we are at our most desperate. When we are in desperate need of saving, our idols prove to be insufficient. The drugs that promise us comfort cannot comfort us. The alcohol that promises us peace cannot deliver peace to us. The sex that promises us rest cannot give us rest. The job that promises fulfillment leaves us empty. When we need our idols the most, we find them coming up small. The sailors experienced this in real time. And so the unexpected happens. In fact, the very thing that Jonah doesn't want to happen with people like this happens. They turn to God. I mean, think about it. Come on. He's on a boat. Think about how in your face this story is. They're repeating the city that he's fleeing to. They're repeating the verbiage of down, down, down. And then he's on a boat with idolatrous sailors. It's like they're throwing it in your face. These are the people that Jonah would not want to be around, and yet here they are. And not only here they are, but they're the ones that are actually turning to Jonah's God and saying, Jonah, what are you doing? Call out to your God. God has incredible ways of teaching us through the unbelievers around us. He's giving Jonah teaching and training and tutelage and discipleship through these unbelievers. Look at verse 7, it says, come, let us cast lots that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. So they cast lots and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you? And he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, what is this that you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. Then they said to him, what shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. And he said to them, pick me up, hurl me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land. These idolatrous sailors working tirelessly to save this man whose fault it is that they're in the storm. Therefore, they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you. These idolatrous men calling out to the name of the Lord, these idolatrous men working so hard to save this man's life. Everything that Jonah hates about the idolater, they're proving him wrong. Verse 16 says, then the men, after they tossed him off the boat, the seas calmed. They realized that it was the Lord's doing. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and they made vows to the Lord. Jonah is with a gang of mariners and sailors on the ocean with nowhere to turn. They try to go back to dry land. They can't go back to dry land. Jonah knows the only thing that's left to do is to toss him. This whole passage is filled with all sorts of irony. The sailors are supposed to be the worst in the bunch. They're supposed to be the God deniers, but they end up being, by the end, the ones that are fearing the true God. They're supposed to be the blasphemers, but they're the ones acknowledging the power of God. They're doing all they can to save Jonah, rowing fearlessly back home to try and get to dry land, but the Lord will not let them back. Meanwhile, here's Jonah, making it his business to announce his loyalties in verse 9. Did you see that? Did you read that? He said to them, I got a suit coat today so I can do it. I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of the sea and the dry land. Listen to this. Puffed up, boisterous, listen, godless sailors. I fear the Lord who made the sea and dry land. And I'm going to get on this sea and go in the exact opposite direction that he told me to go. The idolaters are saying, what are you doing, Jonah? If this God that you serve made this sea, don't you think you need to actually get on the boat and go where he tells you to go? The Lord is making these examples constantly to us. We as Christians, we're strutting around culture, announcing our presence when we walk through the door, while walking in complete disobedience in our speech, in our actions, in our conduct, in the way we sacrifice or our lack of sacrifice, in our commitment to the least, in our love of our friends, in our love for even our enemies. Meanwhile, thus far from God, we see that the people that are supposed to be the most godless are the ones that are responding in a way that's appropriate. They're the ones asking us, if you're for God, why are you acting like this? How often does God use the skeptics in our lives to try and teach his arrogant and wayward people lessons about himself? How much could we gain if we kept our ears open to the lessons he's teaching us in those times and in those people who we arrogantly and self-righteously look past? Now notice throughout this, God's sovereignty is on display. God is demonstrating his control over all things. Every fiber of this journey that Jonah is on, God is sovereign and in control of it to get Jonah where he wants him to be. He's sovereign over the natural events, for example. You see this raging storm that's just brewing because God has called it forth. He's sovereign over even the inanimate objects. The sailors, they don't know, man, let's cast lots. So they cast lots, and what happens? The lots fall to Jonah. Why? Because God controls the lots. He's sovereign over the idols. They're calling on their idols and they're not answering. Why? Because God is over all. He's the only one that we can call on with confidence. He's sovereign over the natural animals. Why do we say that? Well, because in the end of this chapter, what happens? A big fish shows up, swallows Jonah. God is sovereign over this entire journey as he is ours. Even in our disobedience, he reigns sovereign over our journey. Here's one more thing I want to highlight, and this is how much we see, rather, what I want to highlight is how much we see Jesus in Jonah's story, and how different Jesus moves and responds as opposed to Jonah. And it's because Jesus is the greater Jonah. Whenever we look to the prophets and we see in their, what we should always see in their examples, that they're pointing to a greater prophet. When we look to Moses, for example, we should know that there's a greater Moses to come, and that is Christ. Here we see there's a greater Jonah, and that is Jesus. Mark chapter 4, there's a very similar passage to the passage that we're reading right now. Verse 35 through 41, it says, on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And the other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. but he was in the stern asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and they said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased. There was a great calm, and he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" You see the parallels in the stories? Jesus, or Jonah rather, a storm comes, threatening all on board. Jesus, a storm comes, threatening all on board. Jonah sleeps as the storm rages. Jesus sleeps as the storm rages. Jonah is awakened by sailors who are freaking out. Jesus himself as the greater Jonah, and it's found in verse 17. Chapter 1, verse 17 of Jonah. Boat. And they say, "Man, we don't want to do that." But he says, "No, you got to throw me off the boat." And they realize that they have to do that. And it seems almost like Jonah is giving up his life for the sailors. But that would be if you hadn't read to the end of the book of Jonah. Because if you read to the end of the book in Jonah, you realize that Jonah is willing to die on several occasions rather than go to these people. He makes it known that I would rather die than go and preach to Nineveh and see them saved. And so what you see is a man willing to jump off a boat and die in whatever way he has to die, then obey God and turn and go and preach to Nineveh as he should. You say, "That's crazy." Is it? How many times have you heard, "I'll die before I forgive so-and-so"? How crazy is it? How many times have we heard stories where people say, "I'll die before I let a person of this color or that color or that color walk through these church doors"? Not as crazy as we think. This is the way of Jonah, saying, "I'll die before I extend grace to these people that have received this grace from God. I'll die before I do this." But here's where Jesus parallels Jonah. Matthew chapter 12, verse 40, he says, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Jonah is saying, "I'll die before I see these people saved." Jesus is saying, "I'll die in order that these people be saved. I'll go into the belly of the fish. I'll go into the grave for 3 days, 3 nights, which means basically just 3 days. It's not yet, a lot of people try to get their calculator out and say, okay, was he there all the nights, all the days? It just basically means 3 days. It's an idiom that means 3 days. But Jesus is literally committed to going to see us saved, whereas Jonah is committed to leaving in order that we're not. This is the goodness of God in ways that Jonah cannot reflect, in ways that we can't reflect. Because we're far more like Jonah than we are like Christ at times, right? We're far more willing to withhold our forgiveness and say, we'll die before we see these people saved versus dying in order that these people may be saved, which is why we need someone who will go on our behalf and who will die for us. We need someone who will pursue us and who will shower us with his righteousness because we're unrighteous and because when God calls us on so many occasions, we flee and we go in the other direction. So it's impossible for us to meet this God without one who goes before us, without one who dies for us, without one who is actually the greater Jonah, and that is Christ. In this story, we see a beautiful story about one who is pursuing us, even in our disobedience, that he's demonstrating his grace at work, even in the most likely people and likely places. But ultimately, in this story, we have a foretaste and a foreshadow of one who is to come, who will do the work that no other prophet that has ever walked the face of the earth will do. Let's pray.